There is a particular way a man stands when he believes he is exactly where God intended him to be. Feet at shoulder width, hands clasped behind the back, chin neither up nor down, parallel to the floor, which is marble, which is always marble, which has been marble since before you were born, and will be marble long after your particular set of footprints have been buffed away by the night crew. Tariq Mansur stood like that for 22 years. He will tell you this without embarrassment. He will tell you this the way a carpenter tells you he built good chairs, not as confession, not as boast, but as the simple statement of a man who understood his materials and respected his craft. The craft was stillness. The materials were attention and discretion in roughly equal measure, and the ability to be present in a room without being in the room, which is a skill that takes longer to learn than people assume, and which most people, frankly, never manage. He was posted to the royal court in Amman in 1975. He was 23 years old. He had come from a military family in Zarqa. His father had served, his uncle had served, his older brother had served and then been discharged with a bad knee and a pension that wasn't quite enough, and a bitterness that Tariq had watched calcify over Sunday lunches for years. Tariq had no intention of the knee or the bitterness. The royal court was different. The royal court was permanent. Governments shifted. Ministers came and ministers went, usually horizontally, usually to somewhere with a longer title and less actual authority. The palace remained. Jordan remained. These were in Tariq's mind at the time, not different statements. He will acknowledge now, with the particular patience of a man who has had a long time to sit with his own former certainties, that this was a confusion, a significant one. But it was a confusion shared by every man he worked alongside for 2 decades, which does not excuse it but does explain the texture of it, how it wasn't a belief so much as weather. You don't decide to believe in weather, you just wake up inside it. The work itself was not glamorous in the way that outsiders sometimes imagined. There were no moments, or very few moments, that resembled anything from a film. Mostly it was corridors. Corridors and doors, and the management of who was on which side of which door at any given time, and the maintenance of a mental map of the building, so complete and so automatic that Tariq once navigated from the Eastern Security Wing to the archive anteroom in total darkness during a power failure without touching a wall. He is proud of this. It is one of the 3 things from his career that he mentions unprompted. The second is that he was commended personally by King Hussein in 1988 for his handling of a diplomatic incident he is still not at liberty to describe in detail, but which involved a Finnish delegation, a misplaced briefcase, and a level of composure under pressure that his supervisor at the time described in the written commendation as almost preternatural. Almost preternatural. Tariq has always felt that the almost was doing considerable work in that sentence, but he accepted the commendation graciously because that is what the craft required. The third thing he mentions, and this one he mentions last and quietly, and only after the tea has been poured and the first glass is already half finished, is the notebook. But that comes later. The session on the 14th of March, 1997, was not unusual in any way that would have registered at the time. A closed consultation between senior members of the Royal Advisory Council and representatives of 3 tribal confederations from the eastern provinces. The subject, as logged in the exterior security sheet that Tariq initialed that morning, was a water allocation dispute that had been generating friction along 2 provincial boundaries for the better part of a decade. These consultations happened. They happened regularly. Water, land, grazing rights, road access. The specific geography of grievance changed, but the format was fixed. Senior men sat in a room. Things were said. A transcript was produced. The transcript was filed. The dispute either cooled or it didn't, but the transcript existed as evidence that the proper channels had been properly channeled. Tariq was posted at the archive anteroom that morning, which was not his usual station. His usual station was the Eastern Corridor, second post, outside the senior advisor's wing. He was covering for a colleague named Fawaz who had a dentist appointment and who would owe Tariq a covered shift in return, a debt that Fawaz would spend the next 6 months finding creative reasons not to repay, which is a separate story. The archive anteroom post was straightforward. You stood outside a specific door. You logged who entered. You logged who exited. You did not need to understand what happened inside. Understanding what happened inside was not part of the job description, and in 22 years Tariq had become, if nothing else, a man who read job descriptions carefully. The session ran from 9 in the morning. Tariq could hear, not words but volume, the particular acoustic texture of a room with stone walls and high ceilings and several men who disagreed with each other. It is a specific sound. Anyone who has been in a room like that knows it. Not shouting. Something more controlled than shouting, which is somehow worse. The sound of men who are angry and also aware that they are in a palace, and that the level of anger they are permitted to display in a palace is a narrower range than what they feel. It went on for 11 minutes. He logged the start time. He logged the end time. The participants filed out tribal representatives first, as protocol required, then the advisors, then the 2 junior secretaries who had been taking notes and who were carrying the kind of expression that junior secretaries carry when they have been in a room where things were said that they will spend the rest of the day trying to decide whether to mention to their wives. The room was empty for 4 minutes. Then Wali Barakat entered. Tariq logged him, Chief Royal Archivist. Barakat was in his mid-50s at this point, a compact, careful man who wore his authority the way certain men wear expensive watches, which is to say visibly, but without appearing to look at it. He had worked in the archive division for longer than Tariq had been at the palace. He carried the sealed recording from the morning session. Tariq had seen this procedure dozens of times. The archivist reviews the recording against the secretary's notes, confirms the transcript, signs off. Standard. Took usually 10-15 minutes at the outside. Barakat was in the room for 40 minutes. Tariq noticed this the way you notice, standing in a familiar corridor, that a picture that has hung on the wall for years is now very slightly crooked. Not an alarm, just a registration. A small entry into the mental ledger that every good security officer maintains without being asked to. He logged the exit time. He covered the rest of Fawaz's shift. He went home. He did not think about it again for 11 days. The incident log review was standard procedure. Every week, the senior security coordinator reviewed the combined logs from all posts for administrative discrepancies, timing errors, incomplete entries, anything that needed to be corrected before the logs were archived. Tariq had participated in this review hundreds of times. He did not enjoy it. It was the paperwork dimension of a job he had specifically chosen because it was not a paperwork job, but it was necessary, and he was thorough, and those 2 qualities had conspired over 2 decades to make him very good at something he had no particular affection for. He pulled the archive anteroom log from the 14th. He pulled the corresponding session transcript, as filed, to verify the timing entries. The transcript was 12 pages. He had heard 11 minutes. This arithmetic had a perfectly reasonable explanation. Tariq was aware of this. The transcript would include introductory material, formal addresses, contextual framing that the secretaries would have prepared in advance of the session. 12 pages for 11 minutes of contentious discussion among senior men was on the higher end of plausible but not outside it. He read the transcript, not because he was supposed to. The log review did not require him to read the substance of what had been discussed, only to verify the timing entries. But Tariq was a thorough man, and thoroughness, once it becomes a habit of character, does not confine itself neatly to its assigned jurisdiction. The transcript described a consultation that had reached a collegial and considered resolution. The water allocation framework proposed by the Royal Advisory Council had been received, the document stated, with substantial agreement from the tribal representatives, who had raised several minor implementation questions that had been addressed to general satisfaction. This was not the room Tariq had been standing outside. The room Tariq had been standing outside had produced the specific sound of men who were not satisfied, not in a general way, in a specific, architectural, stone walls, high ceilings way that Tariq's body still remembered 11 days later the way a tuning fork remembers a note. He put the transcript back. He corrected the one minor timing discrepancy he had found in the log. Fawaz's handwriting was difficult and the 4 had been logged as a 9, and he filed the review. He stood in the corridor outside his supervisor's office for a moment. Then he went to his post. This is the moment he returns to most often now in Aqaba with the tea. Not the notebook, not the journalist. This moment, the corridor, the decision that wasn't quite a decision yet. The way a man can stand at a fork in a road and walk down one path and not understand for years that the other path was ever there. He began paying attention. This is how he describes it, and the simplicity of the description is itself the point. He did not begin an investigation. He did not begin gathering evidence. He began paying attention, which is a different thing, quieter, more deniable, more sustainable over the kind of timeline that he was, without fully understanding it yet, embarking on. August 1998, a session regarding proposed amendments to municipal boundaries in the northern governorates. Duration, 14 minutes. Barakat's review, 51 minutes. The file transcript described unanimous approval from all stakeholder representatives. Tariq had not been posted at the anteroom for this session, but he had been in the eastern corridor, and the sound that had come from that direction for 14 minutes was not the sound of unanimous anything. He wrote the date, the duration, and the discrepancy in the margin of a small notebook he had purchased for 3 dinars at a stationery shop near his apartment. He did not write anything interpretive. He wrote numbers, dates, times, the gap between what the room sounded like and what the document said it had sounded like. He was a security officer. He logged things. This was not different. February 2000, a session on trade arrangements with a Gulf delegation. Duration, 9 minutes. Barakat's review, 38 minutes. Tariq was not present. He learned the duration from a colleague who had been covering the post and who mentioned it in passing, as a curiosity, the way you mentioned that the coffee machine in the break room has been making a strange sound. Not as a complaint, just as information, because humans are pattern recognition animals, and the pattern was slightly off, and it wanted to be said aloud and then forgotten. Tariq did not forget it. King Hussein died in February of 1999, between the second and third entries in the notebook. This is worth pausing on, because Tariq had initially, in the way that a man reaches for the most comfortable available explanation, told himself that the transcript alterations were a form of protection. The king was ill. The king had been managing an extraordinarily complex political landscape for decades. Perhaps the archive was being curated to protect his legacy, to smooth the record in the way that all records of great men are smoothed by the people who love them, or who need them to appear uncomplicated. This explanation had the virtue of being both plausible and comforting. Tariq held it for approximately 8 months. Then King Hussein died, and Abdullah II came to power, and the sessions continued, and Barakat's reviews continued, and the 40-minute gap on the 11-minute recording continued. Same pattern, different king, different topics, same editorial outcome. Friction removed, consensus manufactured, the palace always reasonable, the challengers always ultimately satisfied. The archive was not protecting a man. The archive was protecting a version of events that certain people needed to be the official version of events. And the man, whichever man sat on the throne, was almost incidental to this project. Tariq wrote this down in the notebook. Then he crossed it out because it was interpretive and he did not trust interpretation yet. He was a log keeper. He kept the log. By 2005, he had 8 entries, 8 sessions, 8 discrepancies. The gaps ranged from 22 minutes to 51. The editorial outcome was consistent in every case without exception. Official record shows consensus. Official record shows satisfaction. Official record shows the palace's position received with gratitude and respect. He had also, by this point, received 2 promotions and a commendation. This is the running gag that is not, on reflection, a gag. The first promotion came in 2001, 18 months after he had begun his informal log. Senior Security Officer, Archive Division, which meant, among other things, that he was now regularly posted at the archive anteroom as a matter of routine rather than as a substitute for FAWAs. He would like to believe this was coincidence. He cannot quite make himself believe it. The more precise and unsettling possibility, which he has turned over many times in the years since, is that someone noticed his attention and decided that the correct response was not to remove him, but to elevate him, to give him a title, a slightly larger office, a marginally more impressive entry on his personnel file, and thereby to install in him the particular obligation of gratitude that makes a man very reluctant to burn down the institution. He has just been given a more prestigious position within. The second promotion came in 2003, Deputy Chief of Security, Royal Archive and Documentation Wing. The commendation came in 2004 for exceptional dedication to institutional continuity and procedural integrity. Procedural integrity. He accepted it graciously. That is what the craft required. He went home and wrote the date and the title of the commendation in the notebook, under the 8 entries, not as data, but as something else, as a note to himself about what the system considered a virtue and what it was actually rewarding, which were 2 different things wearing the same uniform. There is a question that anyone who has kept a secret for a long time eventually has to answer, not for anyone else but for themselves, and the question is, what exactly are you protecting? Tariq had been protecting, he believed, his ability to keep watching. You cannot document what you cannot see, and you cannot see what you have been removed from, and the best way to be removed from something in an institution like this one is to be perceived as a threat to it. So he had not been a threat. He had been a model employee. He had been commended for procedural integrity while logging procedural violations in a 3-dinar notebook that he kept, at various points, inside a copy of a water management textbook on his office shelf, inside the lining of a winter jacket he kept hung by the door, and eventually inside a hollowed-out section of a desk drawer that he had modified himself one weekend with a chisel he'd borrowed from his neighbor. He is not entirely unself-conscious about this. The chisel and hollow drawer phase, he will admit, had a quality of something from a film. The kind of film where a man in a beige office does things that he understands, even while doing them, would look slightly ridiculous if anyone were watching. Nobody was watching. He is reasonably certain of this. But the act of hiding the notebook more elaborately than was probably necessary was itself a form of acknowledgement that what was in the notebook was not nothing, that at some level he had known for years that it was not nothing, and that knowing it was not nothing made the question of what to do with it unavoidable. By 2007, he was 55 years old. He had been at the royal court for 32 years. He had a pension that was not nothing. He had a sister in Aqaba who had been telling him since his wife passed in 2004 that he should move there, that Amman was no place for a man alone, that the air in Aqaba was different and she was not wrong about the air. He had the notebook. He had 14 entries now, spanning 10 years, documenting a pattern of archival alteration that was by this point so consistent, so methodical, so clean in its repetition that it had long since stopped resembling a series of individual decisions and had revealed itself as a system. Systems, he understood from 32 years inside one, do not maintain themselves. Systems require people who believe in them or people who benefit from them, and often these are the same people. Walid Barakat had retired in 2004 and had been replaced by a younger man named Samir Kauri, who was 38 years old and meticulous, and who had arrived in the archive division already knowing what the job required, which told Tariq something specific about how this knowledge was transmitted and to whom. The edits were not Barakat's personal project. Barakat had been an executor, not an architect. The architecture was older than Barakat and was still standing after Barakat left, and that meant that whatever Tariq did with the notebook, he was not dealing with a man. He was dealing with a building. This is, he will tell you, when it stopped being about loyalty. He had been loyal. He had been loyal in the profound and uncomplicated way that young men from military families in Zarqa are loyal, which is to say he had arranged his entire understanding of himself and his purpose around the palace the way a plant arranges itself around light. The palace was the light source. The loyalty was not a choice any more than the plant's orientation is a choice. But the palace, it turned out, was not the palace. The palace was a building. The light source, the thing that had actually organized his life and his values and his 22 years of marble floors and clasped hands, was something he didn't have a clean word for yet. He is still working on the word. In Aqaba, over tea, when he gets to this part of the story, he pauses for a while and looks at the water and eventually says something like, "What actually happened? What was actually said? The record of what was real." And then he says that sounds very simple when you put it like that, and you say yes it does, and he says it wasn't simple and you say no, it wasn't. And then somebody pours more tea. He tried 3 times to do this the right way. The first time was in late 2007. He requested a meeting with the Deputy Director of Palace Security, a man named Colonel Haddad who had been in the post for 6 years, and who was, by all available evidence, a decent man, thorough, fair, the kind of senior officer who remembered his subordinates' children's names without being reminded. Tariq went to the meeting with the notebook in his jacket pocket and a prepared summary of its contents in his mind, and a very clear idea of what he was going to say and how he was going to say it. Colonel Haddad listened for 4 minutes. Then he said that Tariq's dedication was, as always, exemplary, and that the archive division was fortunate to have an officer of his caliber, and that in fact, there was going to be an expansion of the documentation security office beginning in the new year, and they were looking for someone with exactly Tariq's experience and institutional knowledge to head it. Headed, the office would have 3 people under him. The title would be Chief Documentation Security Officer. The salary adjustment was not insignificant. Tariq said he would think about it. He accepted it 6 weeks later. He is not entirely sure why. He would like to say it was strategy, that he accepted the position to maintain access, to keep watching, to continue the log. This is partially true. But he is honest enough, now with enough distance, to acknowledge that it was also because he was 55 years old and tired, and the title was real, and the salary was real, and the alternative was to keep pressing on a door that was being held shut from the other side by people who were very good at holding doors shut while appearing to open them. The second attempt was in 2009. By this point, Tariq had developed a method he considered more sound. He had made contact with a former colleague who had left the palace in 2001 and was now working in a mid-level position at the Interior Ministry, a man named Ramai who had always been perceptive and who Tariq trusted as much as he trusted anyone from that world, which was not quite the same as trusting him completely, but was close enough to act on. He met Ramai for coffee twice before he said anything specific. The third meeting, he described the pattern without showing the notebook. He described the gap between session durations and review durations. He described the consistency across 12 years and 2 monarchs. Ramai was quiet for a long time. Then he said that Tariq should be careful. Not careful in the way that means watch your step. Careful in the specific way that means. The thing you are describing involves people who are still in those positions, and those positions are significant, and you are 60 years away from a government pension, and you have a sister in Aqaba, and you should think very carefully about what you are willing to put in the path between yourself and that pension. Tariq thanked him for the coffee. He did not go back. The third attempt, if it can be called an attempt, it felt at the time more like a surrender to inevitability, came in 2010. Tariq had been in contact for several months through a circuitous route involving his nephew's university contacts with a woman named Layla Barakat, no relation to Walid, who was a researcher at a European NGO that monitored institutional transparency in the Arab world. They had exchanged emails, carefully worded on both sides. She had asked if he would be willing to speak to a journalist she trusted. He had said he would think about it. He thought about it for 4 months. Arab Spring began in December 2010, Tunisia, then Egypt. The television in his apartment in Amman was on every evening for the first 3 months of 2011, and he watched men his age standing in squares, and he understood their anger in the abstract, and he felt something more complicated about it that he has never fully described to anyone, which is a version of guilt specific to people who spent their working lives inside the institutions that other people spent their lives pushing against from outside. This is not a comfortable thing to hold, and he does not ask for anyone's sympathy about it. He mentions it because it is accurate. In March 2011, he decided the plan, such as it was not sophisticated. This was deliberate. Tariq had spent enough years watching security systems, designing some of them, to know that sophisticated plans have sophisticated failure points. The notebook was physical. It needed to move from one set of hands to another set of hands without passing through any system that could intercept, flag, log, or trace it. The most secure channel between 2 points, he had concluded after considerable thought, was one that the system did not know existed. The journalist's name was Marcus Brandt. He was German. He had been based in Amman for 3 years covering regional politics for a Hamburg newspaper. Tariq had never met him. He had a description, late 30s, very tall, came to the Maktabat Al-Erdan, the city's main public library on Al-Kuliya Al-Islamiyya Street, every Thursday morning. He always returned books before browsing new ones. He always used the same drop-off slot on the ground floor. Tariq borrowed a book from the library in January 2011, A History of Ottoman Water Law in the Levant, which was not a book he had any personal interest in, but which was specific enough that the probability of someone else borrowing it before he returned, it was essentially zero. He read it, or rather, he carried it. He kept it on his desk at the palace for 6 weeks, which meant that if anyone had noticed it, and nobody did, because a book about Ottoman water law on the desk of a senior documentation security officer in the Royal Court Archive Wing was essentially invisible. It was associated with his professional context and not with any other context. In the second week of March 2011, he placed the notebook inside the back cover of the book, behind the final pages, and reinforced the end paper carefully with a thin layer of glue he had applied 3 days earlier and allowed to dry, so that the back cover had a small additional thickness that was not detectable by casual handling, but that would be immediately obvious to anyone who had been told to look for it. He returned the book on a Thursday morning. He did not wait to see if Marcus Brandt was there. He did not look around the library. He dropped the book in the return slot, walked to the exit, took a taxi to work, and was at his post 11 minutes later. He retired 4 months after that. The timing was not connected, or not directly. He had been planning the retirement for 2 years, had told his supervisor in the previous autumn, had done everything through official channels with full notice and proper procedure, because after 36 years of proper procedure, it was not something he was capable of abandoning even now. He moved to Aqaba. His sister was right about the heir. The story ran in the Hamburg newspaper in September 2012, 18 months after the Thursday morning at the library. He read it on his phone, sitting on the small terrace of his sister's house overlooking the Gulf. The story described a pattern of systematic alteration of official royal consultation transcripts spanning at least 12 years, based on documentation provided by a source within the Royal Court Archive Division. It described specific sessions. It described the gap between recorded session durations and archivist review durations. It described the editorial pattern: friction removed, consensus manufactured, challenges erased. It did not name Tariq Mansour. The Jordanian government issued a statement describing the report as based on fabricated materials and politically motivated misinformation. Several European outlets followed up. The follow-up coverage lasted about 2 weeks, which is the lifespan of this type of story in the international news cycle, long enough to exist permanently in the record, not long enough to become the kind of sustained scandal that governments actually cannot outlast. Nobody came to Aqaba. This is the part that he returns to with the most ambivalence and the most honesty when he talks about it now. He had expected, when he imagined this moment in the abstract, to feel one of two things: either the relief of consequence, of the thing he had carried for 14 years finally having weight in the world, or the fear of reprisal, of footsteps on the stairs outside the apartment. He had prepared himself, in his careful and thorough way, for both. What he felt was neither. What he felt was the peculiar flatness of an action completed, the way you feel when you have been holding a very heavy object for a long time, and you finally set it down. And for a moment, your arms are still shaped around the absence of it, and you are aware of the weight that is gone, but you are also aware that the room looks exactly the same as it did before you put it down. And the question of whether putting it down changed anything is not a question that has a clean answer. Nobody came to Aqaba. He is not, he says, sure whether this means they decided he was not worth the trouble, or whether it means they never considered him a serious threat, or whether it means someone in a position to make that decision had read the notebook and decided that the cost of turning him into a martyr was higher than the cost of allowing him to sit in Aqaba drinking tea. He does not know. He does know that the archive is still operating. He does know that consultation sessions still happen and that transcripts are still produced, and that whatever Samir Kauri's successor is doing with the gap between the session duration and the review duration, they are doing it in a building that he walked out of on a Tuesday afternoon in July 2011 and has not entered since. He knows that the notebook exists in a journalist's archive in Hamburg. He knows that what he heard through the door on the 14th of March, 1997, the sound of men who were not satisfied, the particular acoustic texture of objection contained within stone walls, does not appear in any official document. He knows that this is not nothing. Whether it is enough is a different question, and it is one he has stopped expecting to answer. He is 68 years old. The air in Aqaba is different from the air in Amman in a way that is real and not metaphorical. And the tea in the afternoon on the terrace is a specific pleasure that belongs entirely to the present, which is the only dimension of time that does not require him to be useful or careful or thorough or right. He pours another glass. The Gulf is the same color it has always been. He drinks it. What he understood, finally, about the institution he had served. It was not corrupt in the way that the word corruption usually implies: explosive, personal, venal, a bad man doing a bad thing for money or power in a way that could be isolated and removed. It was something more structural and therefore more durable than that. It was an institution that had, over a long time and through many small decisions by many careful people, developed a preference for the record over the reality, not as a policy, never written down, never discussed, but as a kind of institutional gravity, a slow drift toward the version of events that made the institution look like what it believed itself to be. The men who altered the transcripts were not, in any individual sense, villains. They were, in the most unsettling sense, loyalists. That was the confusion. That had always been the confusion. Loyalty to the institution and loyalty to the truth of what happened inside the institution were supposed to be the same thing. And in a healthy system, they would be the same thing. And in this system, they had very quietly, over many years, become different things. And the machine that was supposed to tell the difference had been the archive. And the archive was the thing that had been altered. Tariq had spent 22 years learning to be present in a room without being in the room. In the end, it was the one skill that saved him. And the one skill that saved everything he knew.